following program is a presentation of the Options Insider Radio Network. For more programs, visit www.theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio in iTunes.
You wanted it, you got it. A radio program that helps teach you options trading inside and out, basic to complex. This is Options Bootcamp, brought to you by Sogo Trade. Now, let's get you into peak options trading shape. Here are your Options Bootcamp drill instructors, Mark Longo, Dan Passarelli, and John Critchley.
All right, and welcome once again to Options Bootcamp. And I just love that theme. It gets me fired up to do some options drills and some options training. My name is Mark Longo from the OptionsInsider.com, as well as the Options Insider Radio Network. And before we dive in, I want to encourage all of you out there that if you'd like to learn more about any of these topics, you can, of course, find more information about all of this on our website, theoptionsinsider.com, as well as, of course, archived episodes of this program and all of the other programs on the Options Insider Radio Network waiting right there for your listening pleasure. Now, of course, I'm not alone on this program, not by a long shot. I am joined by my fellow drill instructors, the men with the fancy hats and the shiny whistles, starting off with the major domo over at Market Taker Mentoring. He is Dan Passarelli. Dan, welcome back to the program, sir.
Hey, it is always great to be back on this fantastic show, Mark, and really, really happy to be here in this beautiful Midwestern Chicago weather.
It is quite lovely. And it is indeed a pleasure to be on the show that is just tearing it up on iTunes these days. If you want options information these days in an audio format, then it seems like a lot of people are discovering the boot camp. So I take our hats off to all of you new listeners out there. Also joining us on the show, he is the man who runs the roost over at Sogo Trade from an options perspective. He is indeed the Sogo Trade options specialist, none other than John Critchley. John, welcome to the program to you as well, sir.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Dan. How are you guys? I'm really looking forward to training a whole bunch of new recruits. Should be a great year. Really looking forward to it. And how did I lose my Major Domo title in 1 week? Dan's a Major Domo again?
I wanted to mix it up a little bit. You know, we had Major Domo last time. Everyone can't be a Major Domo. You know, you have to.
Can you be a co-domo?
He's a viceroy. He's an archduke. He's a Habsburg of the Sogo Trade Empire. So, yes, I mix it up every week, John. We change it up a little bit just to keep you on your toes. But yes, the titles change, but the show is still that same old Options Bootcamp that you know and love. And without further ado, we're going to dive right into our basic training segment.
All right, Boot, it's time to get in line. What you're going to do is learn. You're going to learn how options work. Do you hear me? Yes, sir. You're going to learn options trading inside and out, basic to complex. There will be no failures. Do you hear me? Yes, sir. Pull in. Prepare to learn. Yes, sir.
All right, and welcome once again to Basic Training. This is, of course, the portion of the show where we introduce some interesting options concepts to you, some basic properties of the options market, and help you incorporate them into your trading. And we talked about a lot of interesting topics on this show in the past in an attempt to introduce you, the basic stock trader, the retail stock trader, into the world of options. And we've referred to the subjects we're going to hit on today on shows in the past. We've never really jumped into them full steam. So we decided to do that today because they are very important concepts to understand when you're trading options. They don't scream off the top of your head as the sexiest. What we find, if you don't understand these, they could really come back to bite you. We're going to talk today about exercise and assignment and settlement. These are kind of the secret backroom stuff of the options world, if you will. People don't really understand how this works, and we've seen some very glaring examples just recently this past year, how if you don't understand this process, it could really come back to bite you in a major way and cost you some significant money. So let's dive into that. And because we have John on the program with us today, and he is indeed a representative of a brokerage firm, this is very much in his wheelhouse. So I'm going to let him run with this. John, why don't you tell our listeners and fill them in on the basics of options exercise and options assignment and settlement and kind of how that whole process unfolds.
Sure, Mark. I'd love to. If you buy a call or put, we all know that you buy the right to buy or sell an underlying at a certain price by a certain time. You also, this is really key, you have the right at any time to exercise that right and take possession of the stock if you're long the calls. And you also have the right at any time to exercise that right and be short the underlying of the stock if you're long the puts. This is called exercise or early exercise. On the opposite side of that is assignment. There's going to be a buyer and there's going to be a seller. The buyer controls the rights. The seller has no controls. So on the other side of the exercise equation is someone who sold these rights. These customers then are assigned and become short the stock if they were short the calls and long the stock if they were short the puts. So that's the basic premise of exercise and assignments in the options world. And remember, I want to bring up one more thing. There are two types of options. We're mostly trade American style. That option can be exercised any time during the life of an option, but there's also European style. And we don't at Sogo Trade deal with index options that in that great a deal, but these are basically index options that can only be exercised during a specific period of time. And again, mostly indexes. The assignment process is that the OCC, which is the Options Clearing Corporation, randomly assigns exercise notices to brokerage firms, who then assign the notices to the customers. It is completely random. I know there's always a myth out there that the biggest customers or the largest traders get better treatment, but I can tell you from experience, it's completely random. So we receive an exercise notice from the clearing firm early in the morning. We immediately notify our customers. We look at their account. We make note if they can take possession of the stock, either on the long side or short side. And if they can, they're okay. If they can't, action needs to be taken by the customer or us to make their account whole, because we don't want the customer to go into a margin call the next day.
Yeah, it's a good point you brought up there, too, about the European versus American. John, I just want to hit on that again for our listeners. There are indeed two styles of options that you will encounter. For the bulk of our listeners who are coming from the stock world and are looking to trade options on those stocks, Apple, Amazon, Google, what have you, all of those options are essentially going to be what's called American-style options, which means you can exercise them at any time. So that gives you that option, pun intended, to come in if you want to and exercise your option early. There are very few scenarios where you would really want to do that. We might outline some of those later on in this program, but it does give you that choice. As John mentioned, the most prominent example that some of our listeners may encounter of a European-style exercise product would be the SPX product, the S&P 500 product put out there by the SIBO. It's a very large, very unwieldy product for a lot of retail. It's primarily geared towards institutional, but if you're trading S&P 500 products, particularly the SPX, then you may encounter this European-style structure where you can't exercise until the product expires. So
I get this question all the time. It's actually a pretty good question. We have a customer that will sell some calls, sell some puts, and they have enough equity in their account, and everything's okay. And then for some reason, they get assigned them, and then we call them that day and say, hey, you don't have enough money to take possession, again, from the long side or the short side. And the reason is because when you sell a put or if you sell a call, the margin requirements are normally 20% of the underlying, and there's other factors also, but basically 20% of the underlying. Whereas if you take possession of the stock, it's going to cost you 50%. So it's a higher requirement to take full possession of the underlying. So that's the reason why some customers get confused on that, and we have to, constantly, reiterate that to our customers.
I think the entire process is confusing to a lot of customers, in particular to those who are newcomers to options. They've been brought up on the ability to be able to hit a bid, lift an offer, and the trade executes instantaneously. So they expect a similar level of functionality and speed when they're doing things like exercise and assignment, and that's when they come into some of the old world ways that the options market still functions. It's not an instantaneous process. It does indeed take a little while for these processes to run their course. You hit on it a little bit, John. Why don't we elaborate a little bit more for our listeners on just what happens? Let's say going into expiration Friday, which is indeed every week now, given the weeklies. Well, going into expiration Friday, your options expire either in the money or out of the money. Let's go into that process then of what happens then when your exercises and assignments are determined, and of course, when those contracts actually settle.
The options settlement is T+1, and the equities are T+3. But if you get assigned an underlying, that is still going to be T+3. And that kind of, I think, confuses a lot of customers. So the same settlement rules apply if you get assigned underlying through options. Even though options are T+1, if you get assigned them and then you take possession of the stock, settlement's still going to be T+3.
Just to clarify there for the listeners, by T+1, he means 1 day after your trade. T+3 would be your trade plus 3 days. So you can see it gets a little bit lengthy when you start dealing with some of the underlying elements of our products. You know, Dan, you obviously deal with a lot of people coming into the option space looking to learn about this product for the first time. When they start bumping into this part of the business, the smoke-filled backroom part of the business, if you will, do they tend to recoil a bit? Are they a little surprised that things are still a little bit antiquated on the back-end side of the options side versus the front end where all the execution and everything really has become so lightning fast these days?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny thing for a lot of people. I mean, once they get to the point where they learn about this kind of stuff and they hear about it for the first time, it certainly does seem a little strange. Like, why should it take 3 days to settle something? I mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that's from how it used to be in the old days where some clerk had to run it up to the 27th floor from the 16th floor, and they probably pad a day because they figure they'll screw it up the first time or something like that. But, now it's all electronic. But to be sure, I think most people who are trading stock, it probably doesn't even register on their radar that it takes 3 days to settle. I mean, it could, depending on the scenario. But, that is kind of just that back end stuff that it's kind of the behind the scenes magic that happens that a lot of people don't really know about or need to care about.
Can I mention one thing about that? When I deal very closely with my margin and some of my very experienced customer service reps, and Dan is 100% right. The settlement issue is really a back office issue, and it really affects only cash accounts and equity trades, and it has to do with a thing called the recycling of funds, which is too complicated for this discussion. But this is why at Sogo Trade and probably a lot of firms, they encourage the customers to open margin accounts, even if they're scared of opening a margin account and very conservative. Sometimes we'll say, hey, open a margin account, treat it as a cash account. So when you want to buy an equity, just pay for it in full, or make sure you have enough money to pay for it in full. This way you have the benefits of margin without the recycling. And if you have a cash account, there's a lot of recycling and when the funds are available. But margin gives you a little bit more flexibility for the customer. So that's what we try to advise. And I think a lot of brokerages do the same thing.
Yes, margin, a very popular topic these days, of course. Many different styles of margin in the option space. If you can afford it, if you have enough cash in your account, portfolio margin certainly is the ideal way to go for a lot of our listeners because, of course, it allows you to get a lot more benefit for offsetting positions than you would get in, let's say, some of the other span and other types of margin. We talked about exercise and assignment here at the top of this, and that I think was what really impacts a lot of our listeners here. And there is something listeners probably want to know: how do I determine if my options are going to be exercised or assigned against me? It's a very simple process, really. It's called the automatic exercise threshold. This is a price limit that is set by the OCC, by the Options Clearing Corporation, like the firm that clears an essential counterparty for all of the options trades that are going on out there. And the limit they used to set was 5 cents. So if your options were 5 cents in the money, they would be automatically exercised. Now, they've changed that. Obviously, that 5 cents gave a lot of wiggle room in and around the strike in which to guess, gee, am I going to be assigned against? There's a lot of questions around that. So the OCC tightened it up a few years back to make that automatic exercise threshold just a penny now. So you need to be aware if you own options at expiration that are even a penny in the money, they are going to be exercised on your behalf automatically. So if you do not want that to take place, if you don't have the capital in your account to, let's say, buy 1,000 shares of Apple or whatever the case may be, I'm sure a lot of people don't have the capital to buy 1,000 shares of Apple, then you need to take some proactive steps to either close out that position prior to expiration, which is, of course, the preferable option, or to contact your broker and say, please do not exercise these shares. I do not want all of this underlying hitting my account. Now, we've hit on that, of course, the automatic exercise threshold. So if your options are in the money by 1 penny, they will be exercised automatically, but there still is some wiggle room, some fudge factor in that. Let's say you're going into expiration Friday and you're trading an underlying that has earnings after the bell, and your options closed precisely, or the underlying closed precisely at the strike that you are long or short. Let's say the 50 strike in XYZ, and XYZ stock closes exactly at $50.00. Well, what do you do? Or you're short the options there particularly. That's where a lot of this risk comes up. That leads us to a topic that can often rear its ugly head around expiration, known as pin risk. And Dan, I'm sure you've discussed this quite a bit with your students over at Market Taker. So I will let you run with the pin risk topic, sir.
Mark, pin risk, as you know from being down on the floor, is really, really super important. And you don't have to have been down on the floor to have gotten bit in the behind from pin risk.
Yes, I've been pinned once or twice in my day.
Yeah. What you were talking about before, Mark, when you said, well, let's say you own these calls or whatever, and earnings is after the close and it settles right at the strike price. Well, guess what? If you own those calls, fantastic. Because you know what? You own the right to exercise. You know, when you're first learning options, you hear people talk about how, oh, you know, when you own it, you own the right, and when you're short, you have the obligation. Those situations is where that stuff really comes into play and really matters. When you own the option, hey, it's your choice. If after the close, you know, the stock that you own, the 50 calls, the stock's at 50, and all of a sudden the stock runs up to $53, guess what? You're going to exercise to collect 3 free bucks. And if the stock falls to 47, then you're not going to exercise to save yourself from losing $3. You own that right. But there's some poor sap on the other side of that trade who's short it. And that guy, he's got that obligation that you learned about in Trading 101, and he could end up getting hosed. If I'm short the 50 calls on expiration day and the stock settles right at 50, am I going to get assigned? I might not. I don't know. If the stock should run up after the close because of earnings or something, I could end up selling the stock, getting assigned, selling the stock at 50 and have to buy it back at 53, 55, 60 on Monday and lose a bunch of money. So that's what pin risk is. It's when you're short an option that's right at the strike price at expiration, and it's the risk of not knowing whether you'll be assigned or not.
Yes, a very dangerous thing. It typically rears its ugly head around expiration, which is when you really need to be cognizant of pin risk. Of course, it used to be a once-a-month phenomenon. Now it's really every week because we have weekly options. And of course, if they start adding even more short-duration products, that could be every day. Who knows what they're going to cook up next in the options market. But it is certainly something, if you're trading a lot of options, you need to be aware of. Another addendum to that, I suppose you could say to that, to pin risk, is just the concept of assignment risk in general. And Dan, we saw this really rear its ugly head very prominently a few months back. A lot of listeners to this show, perhaps, and a lot of new stock traders in general love to trade indices, in particular SPY, and get a nice cheap way to trade and get some exposure to the S&P 500. It's a great, very liquid ETF for them to get in and out of. Of course, a lot of people, it amazes me still to this day, who trade SPY regularly are ignorant of the fact that there is a quarterly dividend. It seems like every quarter this comes out, every time this dividend is announced, we see the same response. People are surprised by it. And what does this have to do with you? Well, we talked earlier at the top of the show, there aren't many reasons or opportunities to exercise an option early. Usually doing that is just a recipe for disaster, because remember on our earlier shows, we talked about all the different components of an option's value, the time premium, the interest premium, the volatility premium, all that stuff is built into an option. When you exercise an option early, you're essentially getting rid of all of that. And all you're collecting is the meat of that option, the intrinsic value. So it usually doesn't make sense to exercise an option early because you're losing all of that extrinsic value of that option. One of the few times it does make sense is when there is a dividend to be captured. And when the dividend is equal to or typically greater than the value of that extrinsic value of that option, then it makes sense to exercise and capture that dividend. And what we saw late last year with SPY, with that dividend they came out with, was there was quite a bit of surprise around that dividend. And we saw a lot of people who weren't perhaps aware of how SPY worked, didn't know that it had a dividend forthcoming, had a lot of short positions around the strike that SPY was trading at. I forgot the exact price level that SPY was at the time. So let's say SPY was at 135. You had people who were short 136s and 137s out in SPY. And it was on a Friday, expiration Friday, of course. A lot of them came in with short upside positions, short 135s, 136s, and they might have been assigned on those. And they were taken unawares. And that, of course, some people might come back and say, well, that's a great thing. You're being assigned on options that are out of the money. That's locking in free profit. And technically, that's true. That is a good thing. But if you're unaware that you have that exposure, that you have that risk lurking in your portfolio, then it's not a good thing, because you come in that following Monday, let's say in this example we saw with SPY, potentially short thousands of shares of SPY that you were not prepared to be that morning. So if you woke up that Monday morning and had some upside calls assigned against you, and let's say SPY then went on to rally substantially on the open that morning, that could have been a very disastrous scenario. So that's just one example of why it behooves you as an options trader to really understand the exercise and assignment process, as well as all of the fundamentals of your product. Understand if your product has a dividend, because that brings this whole exercise and assignment process and the concepts of exercise and assignment risk that we're discussing today into much starker focus, because dividends are when that type of stuff really comes into play. And John, one of the other things we see quite a bit, and I think it leaves a bitter taste in a lot of options professionals' mouths, is people trying to game this system to take advantage of it, to capture the dividends that they're really not entitled to. And these are called dividend trades, and they really are distortive for a number of different reasons. But John, why don't I let you run through how these dividend trades work for our listeners, and indeed why they are such a disruptive and distortive influence on the options market as a whole.
Sure, Mark. I actually wrote about this exact topic for the Option Insider about the SPY dividend debacle. So if you customers want to go back and read the article, you can. But basically, the dividend capturing strategy involves the selling or buying deep in the money call spreads with the intention of exercising the long side and hoping that not all of your short calls get assigned. And when that happens, any call that does not get assigned, you in essence, in theory or in reality, collect the dividend. The play is to take advantage of customers or clearing firms in the SPY debacle. I think it was Merrill Lynch or Bank of America didn't exercise their calls, who do not exercise the deep in the money calls, and thereby they forego collecting the dividend. It's a very controversial practice. I think the controversy stems from the fact that the Philly Exchange either waives fee or has reduced fees, and a lot of these trades take place there, and it distorts the volume. I remember one time at AT&T, there was like 29,000 open interest on one of the lines, and like 750,000 contracts traded on that line, before ex-dividend. So it's a very controversial practice. However, the SEC has given its approval, and it's still a trade. So while the controversy rages, it's still a good trade, and the OCC must clear the trades.
And you're right, it is distortive, and it's one of the reasons why so many people in the options business really tend to shake their heads at this type of business, because A, there's not really much in the way of economic intent going on behind these contracts. Someone's not buying 750,000 or 100,000 of these calls and then swapping them out with another, essentially generating wash trades for the most part. There's no real economic intent there except to try to harvest that little bit of dividend you could capture from whatever open interest exists on those strikes. And you're right, some exchanges have gone to the extent of capping their fees. So if you're going to do 1,000 of these contracts, it's the same price as doing 1 million. So you might as well do 1 million and up your chances in that sense. And so we see some of these absurd levels of trading going on where some contract or some underlying out of the blue will suddenly trade hundreds of thousands or millions of options contracts when it usually does a few hundred or a few thousand. And that's where they get into the distortive element. Not only are these people essentially capturing a dividend that they really don't have a right to, they're in many cases taking that dividend that would have gone to a retail customer if they were perhaps a little bit more informed, if they listened to a show like this and knew when it was advantageous for them to exercise their options and capture that dividend. Remember, if you're a long call trader, keep an eye on the underlying that you're trading, because if there's a dividend coming out, it may behoove you to take that extra proactive step and exercise your option to capture that dividend. Because remember, option holders don't get dividends. Only the underlying holders get dividends, hence these massive dividend plays. And I recall, I think last year, dividend plays amounted for somewhere in the neighborhood of 5% of overall options industry volume, which is just a staggering number. And I expect it to probably go even higher before it starts to come down. We have seen some interesting steps being taken on this front. The Amex recently announced they were essentially no longer going to allow these trades on their exchange. They were going to charge the full rate, which essentially kills that business on their exchange. So that was a very laudable step to actually put their money where their mouth is and say we're not going to take these trades anymore because they are so detrimental to the retail market. But still, it is a large block of activity going on out there. And for a lot of our listeners, perhaps they're scanning for unusual activity, and that's how they key off some of their options trades. They may come across these, and we hear this all the time at theoptionsinsider.com. People will write to us saying, hey, I saw something going on here. I don't understand what it is. And they don't understand enough to know that it's actually a dividend trade and not real activity going up, and it really throws them for a loop when you're looking at unusual activity and using volume as a way to gauge your options trades. All right, so exercise and assignment. Dan, anything else you want to add on the topics of exercise, assignment, settlement, and all that fun stuff?
Well, I think the most important thing is to just make sure that you have at least the basic understanding of the process. If you're not doing some of these things like dividend plays and you're not trying to get super fancy and outsmart yourself, some of that can sit on your intellectual back burner. But just knowing when you can get assigned, when you can exercise, that pin risk exists. Know these basics, because these are the kind of things that are important. And every once in a while, like we talked about before, it can cause you a lot of real grief if you don't understand them.
And you know, Dan, that's true. And I think one of the other elements of the options market that is frequently overlooked, but it is indeed critical to the success of that marketplace and also the safety of it. You know, options and indeed derivatives get painted with this very, very broad brush, often in the financial media and in the general media as a whole, that they are very risk additive products. We saw a lot of people turning around and blaming quote-unquote derivatives for all of the implosions of the financial market in 2008 and 2009. And indeed, there was a derivative component to a lot of that stuff that was going on. But people listening to this show need to be aware that there's a very distinct difference between what we're talking about here on this show, which are listed, centrally cleared options, versus these over-the-counter, unregulated, essentially, derivative products that firms like AIG and others were using that really led to a lot of the debacles that we saw unfolding in 2008, 2009. So there's a very clear difference. And John, I know when you're talking to your customers and your clients over there at Sogo, I'm sure that gives them a lot of peace of mind to know that there are firms like the OCC and this entire clearing process standing behind their trades.
Yes, I mean, the OCC was founded, I think, in the early 70s. So, quite a while ago. It's the world's largest derivatives clearing organization. And basically, it acts as a guarantor. They ensure the obligations of the contracts that they clear, which are the option contracts, are fulfilled. So basically, in a nutshell, the OCC becomes the buyer for every seller and the seller for every buyer. So it protects the counterparty from any counterparty risk. So like Mark said, AIG, that was over counter. That was bank to bank. And if something blew up, then they went to AIG, but AIG had no more money. But with the OCC, if you do an option, it is cleared through the OCC, and they essentially guarantee the trade. So it's extremely transparent and safe way to execute any kind of trade.
I think a lot of people don't really understand that when they first come to options. They're concerned about all these different things they've been hearing in the media. They don't really understand that when they sell an option and a market maker buys it, that they're not selling directly to that market maker. They're selling to the OCC, and the market maker is buying from the OCC. So the counterparty to their trade is not the other side of their trade. It is indeed this large industry-funded central clearing depository that stands behind each one of those trades. When people start to learn that and recognize that, they really do tend to breathe a sigh of relief and realize that there's much more standing behind these trades than there even is in some of the other financial markets that people tend to dive into on a regular basis, like some of these obscure structured products and levered ETFs that who knows who's behind what. But we're talking about listed options right now, listed on the major exchanges. You're trading listed options, whether they're indexes, whether they are equity options, or some of the other products we've hit on the show in the past. They have this depository essentially behind them, and that certainly goes a long way towards, I think, alleviating a lot of the risk and preventing some of these disasters like we've seen at AIG and others from unfolding in this space. For all the disasters people have tried to pin on derivatives, you've never seen a massive explosion or implosion of essentially cleared listed options or options firm. It doesn't happen because all of these safeguards and checks in place to prevent something like that happening. So if you are indeed tentative about diving into the options waters, know that there is a strong counterparty to each of your trades. All right. That's going to do it for our basic training segment for today. And now we're going to dive right into our mailbag.
Mail call. Time to look at questions submitted by our listeners.
All right. I feel like Yankee Doodle whenever I hear that mail call music. It's very patriotic, this show here, the Options Bootcamp. This is, of course, the portion of the show where you, the listener, get to sound off and join us here on the old Bootcamp team to let us know what you're thinking and indeed pick our brains with some of your questions. And our first question comes in via email from Alan P., who's writing out of Michigan. And he writes, you guys have talked about the difficulties of executing multi-leg spreads in the past. What should I, as a retail options trader, be aware of when executing my spreads to guarantee better execution? I think this is, in many ways, Alan, the million-dollar question these days in the options market. If you're referring, of course, to our recent shows we did on spreads, and I encourage you, listeners, if you haven't listened to those, then surf on over to theoptionsinsider.com or check them out in iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you find your audio programs and listen to those episodes, because we do walk through a lot of the issues with executing multi-leg spreads in the options market right now. But essentially what he's referring to is the fact that the exchanges, they all operate essentially siloed independent spread books. And sometimes when you see your brokerage firm listing the NBBO, the National Best Bid and Offer, on a particular spread, what they're doing is combining a bid from one exchange with an offer from another to make this NBBO. But what they don't really tell you in that NBBO number is that those two spread books tend not to really talk to each other very much. So you could come in and try to lift an offer on a particular spread or hit a bid on another one, and your order could be waiting and resting because no one's going to help go out and make the connection on your behalf to try to trade that spread. Some brokerage firms will do that, but it's a very difficult and indeed dangerous process to try to leg a spread for a customer. It leaves them open to a lot of risk. So it's a very difficult process, and one that I think a lot of people are really trying to find ways to improve the experience for retail customers. Now, Dan, I know you work with a lot of these retail customers, and I know a lot of your education and mentoring classes focus around spreads. So this really must be a big topic of concern and something you bring up to your clients and your customers on a regular basis.
It sure is. And it goes back to what we talked about previously in the show, just about before we were talking about pin risk and stuff. And I said one of the most important things about exercise and assignment is just A, knowing the basics, but then, B, knowing things like pin risk, which I guess I would consider to be one of those core bits of knowledge that a basic person needs to have. It kind of goes the same with spreads. I mean, if you want to be good at option trading, you've got to know the basics, but you've got to really understand how those basics really work in real life and kind of know a little bit of the mechanics behind. It's like being good at anything. You want to be a good baseball player. You don't just have to know that, there's first, second, third, and home. You've got to know some of the details about, well, actually, I don't know anything about baseball.
An excellent analogy then, sir. Fine choice.
I could maybe use a better example, but this is why I can't be a professional baseball player, because I don't know those details. I know where first, second, third, and home is. That's all I know. But it kind of goes the same way with spreads. And actually, I think it was either the last show or the show prior to the last one, John gave a really great explanation of how all this works, as I recall. But the gist of it is, and just to kind of summarize what John talked about on one of the previous shows, is like Mark said, you might look and see that the natural bid is 50 cents, and you might want to sell at 50 cents and put in a 50-cent offer, and it doesn't get filled. And that's because you have to understand those exchange mechanics, where there could be 5 market makers on the CBOE and 10 on the ISE and 3 over on, whatever other exchange. And the person who is bid for the one option might not be offered for the other option. So there might not, even though the screen shows a 50-cent bid, there might not be one single person anywhere in the world who's willing to buy it at 50 cents. There might be 2 people, one who would pay X on this option and another person somewhere else who will sell this other option that's part of the spread for Y, and that equals 50 cents. But there's not one single person who will take down that whole trade, and that requires you to leg the trade and blah, blah, blah. Now, for a typical person, for a typical trade, it's probably not going to matter. Just like something like pin risk usually doesn't matter. But every once in a while, it does. And so you kind of need to verse yourself in this. You kind of need to understand the mechanics of the market, what goes on at the exchanges, how it works that way, and why.
And John, you must get this question quite a bit over there at Sogo as well. What do you tell your clients when they call up, how they can minimize the impact of this and what they need to do to really prepare themselves to execute their spreads in this environment?
I mean, I actually, before the podcast, I went into Apple and I love doing these condors. And so I put the condor in my system, and I put the market order out there. And I think the price was, 75 cents, bid to offer to bid. And I think if you went mid-market, it was about 30, 35 cents. So what I always advise, and we've gone over this many, many times in our podcast, are try to go mid-market, maybe a nickel or dime above mid-market, and you may get filled. But don't, for these spreads, unless you really, really need to put the spread on, you're giving away money if you throw a complete market order out there.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that because it sounded like you said put a market order in, but you meant mid-market is what you meant to say. So yeah, you're not working market orders on your spreads by any means. That's just a recipe for a disaster. And I think it's a difficult question you've hit upon, and I don't think anyone really has the ideal solution for this. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of third-party firms trying to come up with ways to address this, either maybe some order aggregators and others who have access to a lot of order flow to be able to try to execute some of these spreads on your behalf for you. Some brokers will actually go out and look at their spread resting orders and try to execute them for their customers. But that, like I said, that's a very difficult process that can leave you open to a lot of potential errors and a lot of delta risk if you do it incorrectly. Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet to this issue. I think, like Dan and John said, you have to be cognizant of the process and how it unfolds. I think it's very clear in this day and age, if you're trying to execute a multi-leg spread with any degree of efficiency, you really have to stay on top of it and be willing to work that order. You have to watch it, be aware of what the MBBO is, but also, if your broker offers this, be able to see the spread books at the individual exchanges, because by having a sense of that, if in Dan's example you see this magical 50-cent bid floating around the MBBO, then if you actually look at the individual spread books, you'll see all the actual exchanges are actually 40-cent bid. And the only way that 50-cent bid is popping in is because there's some resting order somewhere on one exchange in the book, perhaps, that makes it 50-cent bid. And so the screen shows that, but that's not a legitimate, realistic reflection of a bid you can expect in that environment. So being cognizant of that and knowing what the real market is in those spreads will help you to avoid frustration and know where you can really get this trade-off versus perhaps some theoretical MBBO price that you may be seeing on your screen but doesn't really exist.
I think it's very important that the customers, take expiration as serious as, the brokerage firms do. We used to have only, as you guys know, only monthly expirations. Now we have weekly. So there's extreme risk in expiration for the customer and for the brokerage. So we take it extremely seriously. For example, very quickly, we send out emails to our customers every Thursday morning, anyone with any position that's expiring, saying, hey, you have an expiring position. We want to give you a heads up. Also on Friday morning, we call these customers, we call them up. And then we sometimes have to go in and take proactive action. sell the calls, or buy the calls to close the positions, or sometimes we have to go after hours to mitigate the risk. So my message to everyone is, if you're an account of sole trader somewhere else, be very aware of the expiration day. It's in your best interest and in our best interest.
Good points there, John. And of course, staying on the exercise and assignment tip, we have a tweet here from Mr. Riley. I like that. And he says, are there any plans to speed up exercise and settlement in the options market? And that's an interesting question, Mr. Riley. We get some variation on this all the time over at Options Insider. It's they start to learn a little bit more about options. They progress from buying upside calls to buying verticals and spreads, and they start doing short positions. They start learning about things being assigned against them and exercising and how all that stuff takes place, and they're somewhat surprised that we still have this. I referred to it as antiquated earlier in the show, but it is, let's say, a delayed reaction system. They expect, I think, the same level of functionality where they can push a button, execute a trade. They expect exercise and assignment to match up and happen in a much more instantaneous fashion than it certainly does, certainly more than the T+3 that John was referring to for a lot of the underlying trades that currently exists right now. And we've heard some rumblings on this point, Mr. Riley, from the industry and OCC and others that maybe there might be some effort to start to speed up some of these processing things, particularly around expiration, to get some of these trades locked in at a more expeditious time frame. There certainly has been some interest on behalf of the members of OCC and the other firms involved with it to try to do something to the process to minimize the impact of these dividend trades. So that'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. I know that's an initiative that's going underway right now, but so far nothing really concrete to say in terms of anyone announcing any plans that I've heard of anyway. Perhaps John or Dan have heard of something that I'm not aware of, but I haven't heard anything right now that really leads me to believe that there's going to be a massive change to the process coming anytime soon. All right, and last up, we have a Facebook question from Dan Thomas. A lot of Dans on the show today, Dan. It's one of those one of those names you can't escape, I guess. He writes, "Isn't it a good thing for my calls that aren't in the money to be exercised against me? Doesn't that mean that I'm locking in a profit by selling or buying the stock at a more favorable price than where it's currently trading?" Great question, Mr. Thomas. I touched on this a little bit earlier. Dan, do you want to explain the reasons why that might not be a great thing to Mr. Thomas, or shall I?
Yes, because you know what, Mr. Thomas? There are people in this business who are very smart. And the guys who do the biggest volumes, like professional traders, like market makers, just statistically speaking, the guys who trade more are the guys who are more likely to be on the other side of your trade. These are the smart guys. If you're getting assigned and therefore, taking on one of these calls that you're talking about, one of these out of the money calls, chances are it's not a good trade. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, once you get assigned and you end up shorting one of these out of the money calls, it seems like a really good level to short stock. Or, we could be talking about puts as well. The proof is in the pudding. I mean, you'll find out the next morning once the stock opens to see if it actually was a good thing. And chances are it's not going to be.
I saw this question, and then I was trying to think when this has ever happened. And I guess I have one case about one of the Amgen, a drug stock that closed at 49 on expiration Friday. News came out, was trading 64 at 5 p.m. on that Friday. And of course, the people that stuck around, the traders, or maybe institutions, exercised their 50, 55 calls, their 60 calls. But I think the case that Dan's talking about, Dan Thomas here, is talking about is very rare. And Dan's right. If this happens, where you have an out-of-the-money call that is assigned to you, 99 of 100 times, that's not going to be a good thing, because there's some news out, or there's a reason that some smart money, like Dan said, has done this. So don't hope for this. Not a good thing.
And technically, Dan Thomas here is right. Technically, yes, you should be locking in a favorable position, but in the reality of the marketplace, that's usually not the case, because there's usually some other underlying reason that the people are exercising these out-of-the-money options. And typically, you might see that even before they open the next day, with which way the stock is moving, how good of a trade that is. So usually, yeah, they're right. Usually not a good thing, even though technically to the letter of the law, you are correct, Mr. Thomas. It should be a good thing if everything else held constant. But how often are we living and trading in a perfect world? Unfortunately, not very often. With that somewhat sour note, but still a realistic note, I think we're going to close up the mail call segment for this episode. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this episode of Options Bootcamp as well. And of course, speaking of options content, you can find a lot of it at theoptionsinsider.com, including all of the topics we discussed on this show today, such as SPY dividend debacle, the exercise and assignment issues, and pin risk, all the different things that we discussed on the show today. Just type it into the search bar on our website. It'll point you to that and much more. Of course, I recommend all of our new listeners to go back and check out our archived episodes of Options Bootcamp. There's a lot for you to listen and learn from in those episodes. And of course, we'll be back very soon with another episode of Options Bootcamp. But before we go, all of us here on the Options Bootcamp drill instructor team want to thank all of you out there in the listening audience for downloading and streaming and subscribing to this program and making it such a hit, just rocketing up the charts there in iTunes. It's a great thing to see. It means a lot of people are really interested in getting some great, strong foundations for their options trading. And we're happy to provide that here on Options Bootcamp. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time right here on Options Bootcamp.
The preceding program was a presentation of the Options Insider Radio Network. For more programs, visit www.theoptionsinsider.com/radio or search for Options Insider Radio in iTunes.